Wow, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege and a great honor to be with you today, especially since today is very historical for all of you. Changing the actual day of meeting is quite a thing to do, I would imagine. But my great-grandfather once said, there is nothing wrong in change if it is in the right direction, and to improve is to change. So to be perfect is to have changed often. So therefore next year you can change it to Wednesday, and just to keep in keeping with that. I am absolutely thrilled and honored that so many people have come out today to hear me speak. And I actually remember a story that my father told me of my great-grandfather when he went out to make a political speech. And a large crowd had gathered. And this lady came up to him afterwards and said to him, "Mr. Churchill, you must be so thrilled that so many people have come today to hear you speak." And he said, "Indeed I am, madam, but I cannot help thinking, if instead of making a political speech, I were being hanged, the crowd would be twice as big." I hope very much at the end of my talk today that you're not going to feel exactly the same way as he anticipated they might have done. Remembering that this was in the 1930s, and you know, most people didn't want to hear Winston Churchill speak. Some went out purely for the entertainment value because he was considered a comedian. So you might also consider that of me at the end. I'm really honored to have been invited to come and speak to you about my book, about God and Churchill. It has been a project that has been on the cards since 2010 and really only came into fruition in 2014. It is very much God's providence, and I have to say that I very much believe in God's providence, not least of which for the fact that I'm actually here today. My babysitter let me down at the very, very last moment, and which is why I was slightly late in arriving. And very fortunately, my brother-in-law was kind enough to step in place and look after my little son, Jesse, who I'm very proud to say is a half American, so like my great-grandfather. I also believe in God's providence for many other reasons, but not least of which also the fact that Dr. John Morgan is sitting there today. I'm honored to have you here today, sir. Thank you very much for taking your time out to come and be here. I came to John Morgan some years ago after I'd left my wife, and I'd left her because we weren't getting on. We were having a terrible time as a couple. And I sat with John and I talked to him. And I expected as a pastor for him to condemn me and say, "You're terrible, you're evil, you're going to go to hell," and all the rest of it. I was as far away from God as could possibly be. But instead, John sat there and he listened. And he talked about the Bible. He talked about Jesus. He talked about peace. He wanted to pray with me. He took time out of his day to come and have lunch with me, to talk to me, to hear what I had to say. I was amazed. The very first time that we met was on a Sunday morning. He had been preaching at Sagemont, and he had been talking on Moses. And it was amazing, because the night before, I had sat up most of the night arguing with the friend who told me, "You should come along to Sagemont Baptist Church." And I'd been arguing with him about Moses, and about whether or not, you know, this was right, and you know, Moses was set up by God, and it was really unfair that God had not allowed him to walk into the promised land. The very next day, or in fact actually it was that very day, because this was now 2 o'clock in the morning, John preached this very same sermon talking about Moses and talking about that providence, talking about God moving. But for that man, but for God's providence, I wouldn't be here today, and God and Churchill wouldn't exist. So thank you very much indeed. God bless you. The purpose of God and Churchill was not to prove the existence of God. That is obviously going to be an ongoing thing that's going to be happening for the remainder of our days on this earth. And on the last day of this earth, when Jesus does come back, there's going to be a lot of people looking around saying, "What? You were right? Wow." After reviewing the evidence of God and Churchill, my co-author Wallace Henley and I decided that there were 3 central purposes to writing God and Churchill. The first was to disprove the erroneous belief that my great-grandfather was either an agnostic or an atheist. Up till now, historians have written him off as either agnostic or atheist, and God and Churchill proves very definitely that he was not. The second was to use the already very well-researched and undisputed historical evidence surrounding the life and times of great-grandpapa to actually prove that without the intervention of God, as Churchill maintained, he would never have been able to succeed. The third, having proven not only that Churchill had a faith in God, but that the God that he believed in also interfered in his life, as I say, he maintained. That would offer hope to our world at this moment in time. Up until recently, I felt very hopeless. I looked around and I thought, where on earth are we going as a world? What on earth are we doing with this incredible gift that God has given us? However, to read God and Churchill, the research from God and Churchill showed me that God intervened in great-grandpapa's life and intervened at times during the Second World War. That being the case, I felt it was entirely possible that God is intervening in our world today and indeed in our individual lives, if we will only do as Churchill did and humble ourselves and be prepared to listen. To effectively contradict the many well-respected historians who have written great-grandpapa off as either agnostic or atheist, I felt we first had to look at what Winston Churchill himself had to say. I am not a pillar of the church, but a buttress. It is a common misconception that in order to be a person of faith, you have to become dogmatic, or you have to regularly attend some form of religious service. However, the Bible makes no reference to either. They shall be known by their fruits is how a person of faith is determined. The Sermon on the Mount was, as great-grandpapa once said, the last word in ethics. And he said, the more closely we follow the Sermon on the Mount, the more likely we are to succeed in our endeavors. Now, recognizing the Sermon on the Mount as the last word in ethics really isn't a great feat. You know, it's pretty obvious what it was. However, to say that by following it closely, we are more likely to succeed in what we're planning on doing, would, for the agnostic and the atheist, I think, be taking it a little bit too far. However, if you think for one moment that the man who said those words, who gave that advice, actually did fully believe in the inherent power of Jesus' words, not just then, but now, then maybe his advice actually makes more sense. Great-grandpapa wrote, we believe that the most scientific view, the most up-to-date and rationalistic conception will find its fullest satisfaction in taking the Bible story literally. We may be sure that all these things happened just as they are set out, according to Holy Writ. Churchill recognized what rational Christians have realized for years, that science exists to explain concepts we were previously or are currently unable to explain. By his own confession, great-grandpapa was a man of faith, and he professed to believe the literal words of the Bible. Now, over the years since his death in 1965, people have claimed that Winston Churchill, like many modern-day politicians, just rolled God out or the Bible words out purely and simply to curry favour or indeed to win support when fighting elections. In his speeches, such as "Be ye men of valour," and the quote saying, "Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization," many people have said that it's simple political rhetoric. However, great-grandpapa had no need for such humdrum. The evidence that Wallace and I present in God and Churchill strongly supports my great-grandfather's own belief that his life was indeed both directed and protected by, as he put it, divine intervention. I approached great-grandpapa's official biographer, Sir Martin Gilbert, in 2010 with this idea of God and Churchill. In those days, it was, quite a far-out thing, and, I didn't even know how it was going to turn out or anything. And I said to Martin, I'm sure that Churchill was a Christian. I'm sure that Churchill did believe in God. Martin told me, there is a load of evidence to actually suggest you are correct. Go out there and find it. It will be a brilliant biography. As you will notice in the beginning of the actual book itself, I actually dedicate it not just to my beautiful wife and my wonderful son Jesse, but also to Sir Martin Gilbert. Martin gave me the most encouragement that I have ever had in my entire life. It's quite a feat, and it's quite daunting when you write a book on Winston Churchill, but to actually have the temerity to add God in the title really sets you up for quite a lot of criticism and quite a lot of upset, as I have found when I went back to England. Some people were not very happy that I had put God in the title, and many people have argued with me against it. However, the facts stand there. The book is not based on supposition. It's based on Churchill's own confession. It's based also on the evidence that surrounds his life. Further evidence of Churchill's belief in God appears when we look at the account written by his longtime bodyguard, Commander Walter Thompson. Walter Thompson was with great-grandpapa since the 1930s. And Churchill liked to go walking in St. James's Park. Now, out of interest, hands up those of you who have actually been over to Britain. Excellent, fine. For the benefit of those who haven't, number 10 Downing Street, obviously where the Prime Minister resides, is very close to St. James's Park. And great-grandpapa liked to go walking in St. James's Park late at night. Now, obviously, on other occasions, that's absolutely fine. The time not to do that would be during the London Blitz in 1940, when he particularly liked to go walking in the park. He was walking with Commander Walter Thompson on one evening when the sirens started going off. Quickly, he and Thompson hot-footed it back to number 10 Downing Street. As they rounded the corner, a massive explosion was heard. Before Thompson had a chance to say anything, great-grandpapa ran straight around the corner again and stood there absolutely aghast. Where he had been standing moments before was a large crater. A bomb had landed there and exploded. He most certainly would have been killed. Walter Thompson was a man who very much did not like my great-grandfather taking what he considered to be unnecessary risks. Because, you know, Churchill was a man who led from the front. He believed, I have asked these people to basically put their lives on the line. I should do no less than what I have asked them to do. Anyway, he looked at Walter Thompson, he smiled, and with an eerie confidence he said, don't worry, there is someone looking after me besides you. Thompson initially misunderstood, and he said, do you mean Sergeant Davis? Great-grandpapa shook his head and said no, and he pointed to the sky. I have a mission to perform, and that person intends to see it is performed. Our initial research immediately established that great-grandpapa had a faith, and this faith was very real and very much alive, and it was not in some mythical being. He frequently referred to God, both publicly and indeed privately. And he said, I realized with awful force that no exercise of my own feeble wit and strength could save me from my enemies. And without the assistance of that high power which interferes in the eternal sequence of causes and effects, more often than we are always prone to admit, I could never succeed. We easily established the faith that Winston Churchill had. Now we needed to establish, and I mean obviously this was a springboard, but now we needed to establish, did the God that he believed in actually interfere in his life? In order to recognize this, you have to know a bit more than a few stories about Winston Churchill's life. If you look at one or two stories, you could easily say that, well, you know, that was luck. You know, his escape from the Boers in South Africa, that was luck. His survival on the battlefield of Omdurman, oh, no, that was luck. His survival during the First World War in the French trenches, oh, no, that was luck. But if you take Churchill's life in its complete context, you see instance after instance after instance where Winston Churchill could not have survived, where Winston Churchill could not have risen to power. And at some stage you have to admit that luck runs out. Is there anyone here today, and be honest please, is there anyone here today who will gladly raise their hand and credit their entire life to luck? Anyone? I challenge you. I couldn't do it. I don't believe you could. Winston Churchill himself could not. This is evidence. The times I've mentioned 3 stories in this book, in God and Churchill, that drew me to believing that great-grandpapa's life was interfered with by God. There are at least another 20 or 30 other stories that I could easily reference if time were permitting. Of course, if you want to be here till, you know, tomorrow morning, I'm very happy to go through it. But I think some of you have places to go and places to be. The earliest instance we see that this high power intervenes in Churchill's life comes in 1891, when great-grandpapa was 16 years old. He was talking to a friend of his, Merlin de Grasse Evans, and they were talking about their futures. Suddenly, Churchill chirped up that London will be attacked. I shall be in command of the defences of London, and it will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire. Merlin must have been quite aghast by what Churchill was saying, so much so that he wrote this down. And many years later, he sent a letter to Churchill's son, Randolph, when he became his father's official biographer. He said, this is the conversation your father and I had. It was absolutely amazing. Churchill predicted 3 impossible to foresee situations. 1, London will be attacked. For anyone who looks at a map, you can see that London is impossible to reach unless it's via air or unless you are crazy enough to try and fight your way through from the coastline. And I can assure you that the British will stand firm, young and old alike, even if we have to go out with knives and pitchforks, as we did during the Second World War. We will stand firm, and you will not get to London. You may get 1 or 2 people to London, but you're certainly not going to get an entire army. It was impossible that Churchill could know of the invention of aircraft in that early time. Nobody was recording the fact that physicist Samuel Langley in America was actually testing aircraft. Nobody had reported it. However, for the atheist and agnostic, let's just give them one. I cannot prove that Churchill did not know that Samuel Langley was testing aircraft. And so therefore, I'm happy to say for this part of the prediction that Churchill might have known. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's give one for the atheist and the agnostic. However, moving on to the second point, I shall be in command of the defences of London. Churchill was not talking about a time of peace. London will be attacked, and I shall be in command of the defences of London. We are talking at a time when war is taking place, when London is attacked. He is predicting that he will either be Prime Minister or he will be Minister of Defence. It's impossible that Churchill could possibly have known that at a time of war, he indeed would have been in charge of those forces, especially when one considers that in the 1920s and the 1930s, he was the most unpopular man in Britain. Not the most unpopular politician, the most unpopular man. If you were a friend of Winston Churchill in the 1920s or 1930s, that was your only friend. I have 2,500 friends on Facebook, of which I know maybe 100 of them. I'm thrilled to bits that people put in friend requests, I really am. But if I was a friend of Winston Churchill, I would only have one. Isn't that amazing? The man that we hold up today as one of the greatest heroes, nobody wanted to know him in the 20s, nobody wanted to know him in the 30s. You know, and when he started speaking in Fulton in Missouri in 1946 about the Russians, he started to reduce the number of people who wanted to know him then. It will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire. To arrogantly suggest that at a time of war you are going to be in charge of the defences of London is one thing. To then go on to state that it will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire is really quite amazing. But if you think about it, in 1940, when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, he was the only person in Britain who was able and willing to take the reins of power and to become Prime Minister. He was pretty much the only person in Britain who believed that Adolf Hitler could actually be beaten. Everybody else wanted to surrender. Everybody else wanted to give up. But Winston Churchill believed that in God's good time, this would happen. We would win. He clung to the prediction, to the prophecy that had been given to him when he was 16 years old. And religions around the world define the difference between a prediction and a prophecy very clearly. A prediction can come from anyone, and it doesn't necessarily have to come true as the way it's said. A prophecy can only come from God. A prophecy has to come true exactly as the person who spoke it said it. So let's look at it and tell me, answer me these questions. Was London attacked? Yes. Sorry? Yes. Was Winston Churchill in charge of London and the defences of London at the time when it was attacked? Yes. Did we win the war? Yes. It came true exactly as Winston Churchill said. London will be attacked. I shall be in command of the defences, and it will fall to me to save London, to save the capital, to save the empire. It did. Further evidence of this intervention can be seen when we consider what would have happened if Winston Churchill had actually been a popular politician. He would have certainly been in the MacDonald-Baldwin government when Hitler rose to power in 1933. He would have remained in the Baldwin administration and certainly would have become an avid supporter of appeasement under Neville Chamberlain. However, in 1939, on September the 1st, he would have woken up with the rest of the world to realise that we were at war. And he too would have been tarred with those terrible words in history, too late. Divine intervention stepped into great-grandpapa's life and kept him at the very back in politics. Churchill came to power in 1940 and nobody could blame him for anything that had happened. Nobody could blame him for the Treaty of Versailles, which he spoke out against, which caused the Second World War. Nobody could speak to him about the rise of Adolf Hitler or blame him for that. He warned about it. Nobody could blame him for the rise of the Nazis and the fact that when we went to war in 1939, we were the most unprepared country in the world. We were nuts. We were crazy going to war against a man 5 times our strength. Nobody could blame Winston Churchill for that. And Winston Churchill left that situation in 1945, having by divine providence led us to a victory, led the world to a victory. He left it a world hero, a relationship, an accolade he does not accept, he never accepted. He said he was blessed to be the roar of the lion, that it was the nations around the world that were the lion's heart. He was merely honored to be called upon to be its roar and to sometimes point out where the lion should use its claws. We each have a bit of Winston Churchill within us. We each have those qualities of courage, of faith, and of integrity. My next book that I'm writing at the moment is called Lead Like Churchill, Courage, Faith, Integrity. And it talks exactly about that. It talks exactly about how Winston Churchill found this courage, found this faith, and found this integrity. But unlike any other leadership book, it doesn't teach you to duplicate Winston Churchill. It empowers you to find those Churchillian leadership qualities within you. We each have those Churchillian leadership qualities within us. It is a matter of finding something that will draw them out. And I would ask and encourage every single one of you to please visit my website, leadlikechurchill.org. And on there is a short survey, a 3-question survey about the relevance of Winston Churchill today. I believe that great-grandpapa was not only relevant in his time, but is relevant today, especially today, when we are looking at political elections, when we are choosing, or when you are choosing, the next president of the United States. Measure them against Winston Churchill. Do they lead with courage? Do they lead with faith? Do they lead with integrity? When you find a person that does, that is your next president. That is the next Prime Minister of Great Britain. If we look for Churchill, then we have learnt nothing. But if we look for people who have courage, faith, and integrity, and if we look within ourselves to find that courage, that faith, and that integrity, then everything that Winston Churchill stood for has value. Stop looking to depend on other people. The American dream is very clear. With hard work, you can achieve anything. It doesn't say that with Winston Churchill you can achieve anything. With John Morgan you can achieve anything. You know, with my wife I can achieve anything. No. With hard work yourself, you can achieve anything. America is the most amazing place I've ever been to. It's the most amazing country. It's got the most amazing people. You guys are wonderful. The reason the world hates you is because the world is jealous. You really are amazing. You should look at everything that you've achieved. My great-grandfather was very proud to be half American. Very proud indeed. He loved this great nation of yours. And he was really honored in 1963 when John F. Kennedy made him an honorary citizen of the United States. Sadly, he could never use it. But the fact of the matter is that he genuinely was thrilled that he had been given that. He once said in 1941, had my father been American and my mother British instead of the other way around, I might have got here a lot sooner, and indeed on my own. Well, you know what? I found this country in 1989. I first came to this country. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with its people, and I determined that this was the place I wanted to live. Pasadena is definitely the place I want to live as well. I really like where we've moved to. It's really nice. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that we've got a few moments to answer questions. Is that all right? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Was he his intelligence? That was his expertise, intelligence? Churchill?
No. I mean, his expertise was really in the military. I mean, that was, military and politics.
Did he not design intelligence and seek stuff when he was in World War II?
Very much so, yes. He very much depended on Desmond Morton, whom he rose in the ranks to actually become the head of what was MI5, is now MI6. So that was his James Bond. And yes, I mean, he very much relied on the intelligence. During the 1930s, there was a gentleman in the Foreign Office called Ralph Wigram, who you'll probably never have heard of. And he was quite high up in the Foreign Office, and he would approach my great-grandfather reluctantly initially and start giving him secret documents proving that Germany was rearming and proving how they were doing it and how quickly they were doing it. We all make a massive mistake and we blame Neville Chamberlain for leaving Britain unprepared for the Second World War. But it wasn't Neville Chamberlain, and it was never my great-grandfather's intention to allow that blame to fall on Neville Chamberlain. It was actually Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin who chose blatantly to ignore the black and white facts from our spies over in Germany, who showed that Adolf Hitler was building loads of schools where you would see school children walk in and fill the classrooms around. In the center of these schools was a factory, and that factory would turn out munitions. The Hitler Youth was an easy way of forming an army. It was like the Boy Scouts, but perverted. The Boy Scouts is a brilliant, brilliant organization. But then what do? You change them into little soldiers. You don't just teach them how to shoot, you teach them how to do this, you teach them how to do that, because you know at some stage you're going to send these boys into war. You know that that's what you're preparing them for. And that's what Hitler did. We knew all of this, and we ignored it. Stanley Baldwin lied in 1935, and my great-grandfather called him out on that based on the facts that Ralph Wigram had given him. And that was the reason that we were actually able to be prepared for the war, because we forced Baldwin to actually admit this. So yes, Churchill relied very much on intelligence. Yes, sir.
Did Churchill serve as Prime Minister both as a conservative and a liberal? Would you comment on that?
No, he didn't. He was only a conservative when he served. He actually came back to the Conservative Party in the 1920s. And having been away from them since 1904, he returned back in 1924. So he was a conservative on both occasions. Yes, sir.
I can remember my daddy explaining that name to me when he took office. I was 9 years old.
Wow. The second time?
No, the first time.
The first, you were 9 years old, the first, oh wow. Gosh. So you remember the war?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have lived through those years, but also I would like not to have lived through those years. But it was the most, we've seen it on very rare occasions, that entire worlds join together in crises like world wars and things like that. And the camaraderie, the time, I mean, when the Americans came over to Britain, we were so relieved to see them. We were so relieved to see you guys. It was amazing. And, you bring with you an awful lot of fun. And I think we had been at war now. We'd been at war for a couple of years, and it had really sort of drained our spirits. And then in 1941, the Americans started coming over, and it was like, you know what? These guys are fun. They're fresh. They brought some happiness, brought some intelligence, brought some really good jokes. So you guys did really well. Yes, sir.
Didn't you say, either said or I read it in the book, that he was the only world leader at the time that had read Mein Kampf?
Yes.
Cover to cover?
Yeah, pretty much, yes.
He knew.
Yeah, it's amazing. Hitler brings out Mein Kampf in 1925. He becomes the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and still nobody bothers to read the book. And in 1935, it was obvious that he was restarting building Germany's army and its navy back up and air force and things like that. All the things against the Versailles Treaty, and still nobody read Mein Kampf. Then suddenly, when war was upon us, as Great-Grandpa pointed out, it became the most important book to actually study. Churchill had already studied it. He already knew. And it's very nice of Hitler to give us his ideas, give us his plans, because he laid out exactly what he was going to do during the war. So it made it a little more easier for us to know what we were dealing with. This is why we had opportunity after opportunity to assassinate Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. We didn't. Because we knew that we understood Adolf Hitler. Many people have written him off as crazy. Adolf Hitler wasn't crazy. In order to be a lunatic, you have to either not know what you're doing or not know that what you're doing is wrong. Okay? Hitler knew that what he was doing was wrong. He knew that he was causing blatant havoc and he was doing blatant murder. And so, he's been written off as a lunatic, and I'm afraid that is a great insult to people who genuinely have mental illnesses. But Mein Kampf was a brilliant book, but I cannot read that book. Like listening to Wagner's Rienzi, which is a 5-hour opera. I love opera, but really that's a terrible opera. I sit there and I listen to this, and I didn't speak German, and I got really angry. And when I read Mein Kampf, once again, it brought out that anger. There is something within that book that is inherently evil. There is something within that book that is just, it's written in between the words, you know, and I don't know what it is. I could never define it. I would need to be a theologian to actually understand it. But there is something in that book that is very evil. And it's incredible reading Mein Kampf. Yes, sir.
At what age did the Queen knight him as Sir Winston?
In 1953, he was knighted as Sir Winston Churchill, and it had been through much resistance. He did not want to be Sir Winston Churchill. He had maintained, as I said before, that he had just been the Lion's Roar and that everybody else deserved the honours. But the Queen insisted that he became a Knight of the Garter. And as I understand it, it came down to basically a threat that if you don't come to Buckingham Palace to accept the Knight of the Garter, then I'm going to come to 10 Downing Street and bestow it upon you there. This is, as I understand the story to be. I have no historical basis on on which to put it. And great-grandpapa was very honoured to accept it, but he did want to die Mr. Winston Churchill. But, you know, the Queen had very definitely wanted to honour him in this way. So, yes, sir.
One of Churchill's children are you a descendant of?
I'm a descendant of Diana Churchill, his eldest daughter. And she married my grandfather, Duncan Sands. And they had my father, Julian, and then he obviously, with my mother, Elizabeth, had me. Hence the reason I'm a Sands.
Would you comment on the specific points of the Treaty of Versailles you said led to World War II?
Yeah, the financial side of it. We billed the Germans 400 billion Rentenmarks. In those days, a billion hadn't even been thought of as a currency figure. So 400 billion was absolutely ridiculous. And it wasn't until about 2011 that the Germans actually would have managed to pay this off. And I remember a Saturday Night Live sketch where you got this woman sitting there as a German news reporter and saying, "We have finally paid off the debt from World War I. That is it." And she pushes the file aside and it gets taken away and everything like that. And then she looks around and sort of thinking, this is really great, really amazing. And suddenly this massive file is put in front of her and it says, debt from World War II. So she's most upset. We caused the situation because we pushed Germany into such a terrible financial situation. In 1925, in order to buy a loaf of bread, you would take a wheelbarrow full of money to the bakers. If you were robbed on the way, they would leave the money and they would steal the wheelbarrow because the wheelbarrow was worth more. This is why you don't print money. Okay, this is why money should not get printed over and over again. Now, I'm all for printing money because, you know, give me loads of money. But unfortunately, as I understand it, it devalues money by having too much of it. So,
How about his relationship with Eisenhower?
his relationship with Eisenhower. Once again, this was an interesting relationship. He had a great respect for Eisenhower. Eisenhower had a great respect for him. And I'm very pleased you've asked this question, purely and simply because it gives me the opportunity to actually tell you a story. On D-Day, June the 4th, was absolutely fun. It was like the best. Everything had changed from June the 4th to June the 8th. Everything was changing and changed completely the face of the war. Great-grandpapa told Eisenhower that I'm going to be present for the invasions. I'm going to be present on the 6th and I'm going to be on one of the ships. And Eisenhower said, no, you're not. Eisenhower wasn't a crazy man. He was not going to take responsibility for great-grandpapa's life. You know, Winston Churchill, he's like this hero already. We're almost at the end of the war. Everybody loves Winston Churchill. So no. I am not taking responsibility. I'm not going to be the general who goes down in history as the man who allowed Winston Churchill to sink to the bottom of the channel. So no, that's not going to happen. So he told Churchill no. Winston Churchill looked at him and smiled, and he said, and when Churchill was Prime Minister and also Minister of Defence. So, you know, it's the first time that those offices had ever been combined. And he looked at Eisenhower and he smiled. He said to him, we are very grateful that you Americans have come over, and I recognise that you are doing a sterling job, you know, running the European side of things and everything like that. That's really great. However, You do not have the authority to decide whom His Majesty places on His Majesty's ships. And so therefore, I will be present at the D-Day landings. Eisenhower wasn't a fool. He knew he wasn't going to get anywhere with Winston Churchill, so he went one rung up the ladder, and he went to King George. And he spoke to King George. He said, this is the situation. Well, Great-Grandpapa and King George had regular Tuesday meetings, and this happens. The Prime Minister always meets with Her Majesty once a week, and it may be on a Wednesday, maybe a Tuesday, maybe a Thursday, it doesn't matter which day it is, but they meet. And it's so that the Queen can receive an update on what's happening, but can also offer advice. In this case, it was the King. And they met on a Tuesday for lunch. And they had a lovely lunch together. Wonderful, wonderful conversation. And at the end, when they were enjoying their coffee, it was the King who decided to bring up D-Day. Winston, he said, I understand that you want to go to the D-Day invasions. He said, yes, yes, I do. It's a wonderful idea, absolutely wonderful. I've decided I'm going to go with you. Well, Winston Churchill thought for a moment. He said, okay, that's not a problem, but I need to check with my cabinet first. I'll get back to you and I'll confirm that with you. The King at this point got up and stormed out of the room. He had not got the response that he had hoped for. He had hoped that Winston Churchill would say to him, look, you can't go. It's far too dangerous. You know, you're invaluable. We can't afford to lose you. But instead, Winston Churchill said, fine. It took a personal letter from His Majesty to Great-Grandpapa saying, look, I've actually decided I'm not going to go. And I feel that, that being the case, it would be wrong that the King's First Minister go and not have the King next to him. I feel that we would be in the way, and it could be an embarrassment to the troops if we were there. And I would be grateful if you would withdraw your request. Great-Grandpapa had a great respect for the monarchy and a great friendship and respect for King George. And reluctantly, and I say very reluctantly, he regretted it for the rest of his life, but reluctantly, he withdrew the request. But he was not prepared to send the troops out to fight without standing there on the front line with them. He wanted to be with every single person who stood on that front line. He had no fear because he had an incredible faith in God. He knew that God had designed him for one purpose alone, to fulfill the winning of the Second World War. He didn't do it himself. Without God's providence, he would never have done it. Without the lives of the millions who worked so hard with him and made this possible, this wouldn't have happened. I want to thank not just you, I want to thank your parents, I want to thank your grandparents for everything that they had done and have done for Great Britain and with Great Britain, both during and since the Second World War. I reiterate again, what an amazing people you are, what a wonderful country you have. I have the privilege of living here, and thank you for your every kindness. God bless you, God bless Rotary and its mission, and God bless the United States of America.